Nicaragua decides this Sunday, November the 7th, and teleSUR talks with journalist and editor Ben Norton on this electoral process. Welcome to teleSUR. Ben, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
After the campaigns of the presidential candidates closed on Wednesday, I ask you, what could happen next November the 7th? Who do you think will win? I mean, are you still betting on the running mates Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo?
Polling has consistently showed over many months that the Sandinista Front is by far the leading party in Nicaragua. It has the support of around 2/3 of the population. And that is not just polling from the past month, the past few months. That is polling consistently over many years. The right-wing opposition forces in Nicaragua are extremely unpopular. People in Nicaragua remember the neoliberal era from 1990 until 2007, in which everything was privatized, including water and energy, and a time in which poor and working class Nicaraguans suffered from chronic blackouts. They would lose power for basically half of the day from the night until the morning. They constantly were losing water. They had very little access to potable water. They didn't have paved roads. Nicaraguans have a memory, a political memory. They remember how difficult the violent years of the neoliberal period were, and the Sandinista Front is extremely popular. So if you consistently look at the polling, it is very likely that President Daniel Ortega and Vice President Rosario Murillo will win again, because the opposition, the right-wing opposition forces, have simply discredited themselves, and they further discredited themselves in 2018 by launching a very violent coup attempt to try to violently overthrow the government. They failed to do so, but hundreds of people died, and they only further discredited themselves. And now the majority of Nicaraguans see the right-wing opposition as totally illegitimate, extremist, and controlled and funded by the U.S. government. So really the only significant political force in Nicaragua is the Sandinista Front, and they're very likely going to win the elections.
You recently wrote on Twitter that social media outlets are imperial weapons of the authoritarian U.S. regime. And you wrote this based on the fact that 4 days before the Nicaraguan elections, YouTube suspended 82 Sandinista channels. Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter also censored hundreds of Sandinista communicators. Will this be the scenario we'll observe in social networks the closer we get to the November 7 elections? What interests did the social networks respond to?
Silicon Valley corporations, these big tech companies like Google and Facebook and Twitter and many others, they really have their origins in the U.S. national security state, in the Pentagon, through research during the first Cold War. And the reality is that today, these social media corporations really act as instruments of the U.S. government. They frequently censor anyone that challenges U.S. government talking points. And we saw this so clearly in the past week, just a few days before the elections in Nicaragua on November 7th. We saw, for instance, that Twitter suspended many prominent pro-Sandinista journalists and activists, and then Facebook deleted over 1,000 accounts and pages that support the Sandinista Front, including, I personally know multiple journalists, friends, colleagues, activists. I know people in flesh and blood who were suspended by Twitter and by Facebook, and Facebook and the parent company Meta claimed that these people are supposedly government-run trolls or bots. That is a complete lie. It is a blatant form of election meddling. And it's incredible because the US government claims supposedly that Russia meddled in the 2016 presidential election in the United States. The US couldn't find any evidence of this after years of investigations, billions of dollars spent. The only so-called evidence that Washington could find are supposed Facebook memes allegedly posted by a Russian company. Meanwhile, we see a few days before Nicaragua's elections, the social media corporations did a systematic purge of hundreds of pro-Sandinista media outlets, journalists, and activists, essentially trying to remove anyone who supports the Sandinista Front. So only the US-backed right-wing opposition can dominate the narrative about the election. And of course, this came when the US Congress also passed the so-called Renacer Act, which means more devastating sanctions, economic warfare against Nicaragua. This is a blatant form of meddling in Nicaragua's internal democracy by these unaccountable Silicon Valley corporations that are basically arms of the US government.
Ben, this behavior of social networks is not new. They have operated in the same way and even worse in other countries. How prepared are the Nicaraguan electoral authorities to lead with the situation and then guarantee the harmful online messages not interfere in the silence period and the election day itself?
It's absolutely right that these big Silicon Valley corporations have constantly censored the targets of the U.S. State Department. We've seen constant censorship of media outlets, journalists, and even politicians, top-level officials in countries like Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, Russia, China. Basically, any country where the U.S. government wants regime change, where the U.S. wants to overthrow the independent sovereign government in that country. We see that Facebook, which owns Instagram, and we see that Twitter and YouTube, which is owned by Google, constantly censor these countries, constantly meddle in these countries' internal electoral processes, while ironically allowing right-wing bots and trolls to spread propaganda and fake news, as we saw in the coup in 2019 in Bolivia, in which there were tens of thousands of fake accounts, trolls, and bots spreading fake news and support of the coup, constantly spreading fake news, constantly demonizing Cuba and Venezuela and other countries. So, of course, this form of meddling is not new, but fortunately, the electoral authorities in Nicaragua are very professional. They are, unfortunately, they are very used to foreign meddling in their internal democracy. They're used to the US government and Western European governments constantly trying to demonize and sabotage those electoral processes, trying to delegitimize the elections in Nicaragua, and funding right-wing opposition figures, not only who tried to destabilize and delegitimize the election, but in 2018, who tried to violently overthrow the elected government. So the reality is that the Nicaraguan government is unfortunately very accustomed to seeing its sovereignty violated by the United States and by Western European countries. And it still is very much a democracy. It still is very much an open democratic society. But the reality is that the Nicaraguan government is not going to tolerate violent coup plotters that tried to overthrow the government, as they did in 2018. It's no longer going to tolerate that. And Washington and Brussels, that they're trying to punish Nicaragua for taking punitive action against these coup plotters that have been trained, cultivated, and funded by foreign powers to try to delegitimize and destabilize the elected government.
Ben, let's now talk a little bit on the elections that will take place on November 7th. Other elections, I meant, in Nicaragua, the parliamentary ones, I mean. To you, which party is most likely to get the largest number of seats at the National Assembly, and therefore they will make it easier or more difficult for Daniel Ortega, his next government, if he's finally reelected?
Well, as I said, polling consistently shows the Sandinista front has around 2/3 of support from the population. These are polls over many years from the leading polling firm inside Nicaragua, which is called MIR Consultores. The other polling firms, maybe you've seen in Western corporate media outlets, they're usually not in Nicaragua. They're not legitimate polling. The most legitimate polling firm is MIR Consultores, and its polling over many years has shown the Sandinista front has around 2/3 of popular support, and that the other right-wing opposition parties have single-digit support. Now, there are opposition parties that are participating in the election. The U.S. government and Brussels falsely claim that Nicaragua only has the Sandinista front. That is a lie. There are numerous parties participating. In fact, the majority of parties participating in the election are anti-Sandinista parties. Of course, you're not going to hear that in CNN or other corporate media outlets, the New York Times. But the reality is that they do participate. They simply don't have much popular support because the average working class Nicaraguans know that those neoliberal parties only support the interests of the oligarchs, of the capitalists, of the US government, and of other foreign capitals. So all the polling shows that the Sandinista Front is going to win a majority. And that is completely unsurprising because it's the only party that has actually provided social programs to Nicaraguans, including free healthcare, free education, other social programs to help poor and working people, including providing public housing, roofs over their heads. The neoliberal parties have never offered any of those social programs for poor and working Nicaraguans, and that's why they have little support.
And last but not least, Ben, what's the geopolitical importance of these general elections for the region? Let's not forget that Nicaragua is an active member of the regional organizations such as ALBA and CELAC.
Nicaragua's election is very important for the region because it's yet another example of a country that is trying to pursue an independent, sovereign path where the US government is trying to overthrow that independent, sovereign government, and where the people of Nicaragua are saying that they want to work together with other countries in Latin America to develop their region, to be free and independent after hundreds of years of foreign colonialism, first by the European colonialists and neocolonialism by the US government, the so-called Monroe Doctrine. The US in 2009 backed a far-right military coup in the neighbor of Nicaragua, that is Honduras, and Honduras has been suffering under a horrific narco regime, a dictatorship, since 2009 because of the US neocolonial policies targeting Central America. We saw, of course, in the 1980s that the CIA armed fascist death squads, the so-called Contras, that terrorized the Nicaraguan people. And the Nicaraguan people are tired of foreign meddling to try to destabilize and overthrow their independent sovereign government. In this election, they're very likely going to send a message to Washington and to Brussels that they value their free, sovereign, independent government, their left-wing government that provides free healthcare and education for them. They are going to refuse to be colonized, and they want to continue to work with other independent countries in the region, such as Venezuela, such as Cuba, such as Bolivia, these countries where the US government has constantly organized violent coup attempts. The Nicaraguan people are tired. I live in Nicaragua. I constantly talk to people in Nicaragua. I have gone to many working class barrios, and I've talked with campesinos working in cooperatives in rural areas. They all say very similar things. They might have criticisms of the government, but they all say very similar things. We support our government against foreign intervention and foreign meddling because the US government on repeated occasions has militarily occupied our country and brutalized our people. That is why Augusto Sandino in the 1920s and 30s created a guerrilla army, not just of Nicaraguans, but of revolutionaries from across Latin America to fight the illegal criminal US military occupation, to expel the US military occupiers out of Nicaragua. And at the ballot box, Nicaraguans are very likely going to send the same message in the 2021 election, telling the US hands off Nicaragua.
Thank you very much, Ben, for this interview. And I invite you to join us on next Sunday, this Sunday.